Chapter 13. Hans spent his days in the living room, reading books in Braille and listening to the radio. His only respite was Lisa's practice session. Each evening when she returned from work, he happily joined her at the piano bench, tapping his cane to the rhythm of her Czerny exercises and offering praise and suggestions with each new piece she'd tackle. After each session, he returned again to the radio. The recent news had been grim. The Nazis had landed in Norway, invaded the Netherlands, and entered Belgium, Luxembourg, and the north of France. The third Sunday in May, Hans spread the word that there would be an important broadcast that evening, the first speech by the new Prime Minister. Almost all of the 32 residents crowded into the living room as Hans turned up the volume. Winston Churchill's voice was powerful and magnetic, and they leaned forward to hear every word. I speak to you for the first time as Prime Minister in a solemn hour for the life of our country. A tremendous battle is raging in France and Flanders. The Germans have broken the French defenses north of the Maginot Line, and the strong columns of their armored vehicles are ravaging the open country. It would be foolish to disguise the gravity of the hour. It would be still more foolish to lose heart and courage. For myself, I have invincible confidence in the French army and its leaders. When Lisa went to bed that night, she was trembling with fear. She pulled out the pictures of her mother and her father and held them close to her as she fell asleep. 2 weeks later, Lisa received 2 letters. One was from Sonia. I have enough to eat and am learning to speak English, but I miss you very much and... The second letter was very disturbing. It was her own letter to her parents in Vienna, addressed to 13 Franzenbruckenstrasse, which had been sent back stamped undeliverable. Lisa called a committee meeting in despair. Gunther, Gina, Paul, Aaron, and Lisa gathered around the dining table and shared their worries. None of them had received any recent news of their parents. They agreed to meet at the Bloomsbury house the next day after work. The beleaguered old building was familiar by now. The Jewish Refugee Agency offices inside were still overcrowded, no longer with lost children, but with desperate relatives searching for news. The 5 teenagers convinced the volunteer secretary that they had to see Mr. Hardesty himself. "And how is Williston Lane?" he asked as they were ushered into his office. "Mr. Hardesty, we do not have one word from our parents," Lisa said. "No one is giving us any information." Lisa handed Mr. Hardesty a handwritten list of the names of all their parents. "Please, can you find out where they are?" He took the list of names and read it, then leaned back in his chair. "We know very little. The Red Cross is trying to find out all they can. All we know is that many Jews are being sent to relocation camps, and that is why you are not receiving letters." "Camps?" Gina asked. "Relocation camps. We know very little about them. I'm sorry. Now, if there are any questions about England, I'd be..." Aaron stood up rudely and headed for the door. The rest followed, but Lisa stayed for a second. "Thank you, Mr. Hardesty," she said. When Lisa and Gina went to work the next day, the tabloid headlines reported the worst. Paris falls to the Nazis. De Gaulle flees to England. Lisa took Gina's hand and began to walk faster. "We can make it, we can make it," they chanted, pushing the fear away. At Platts & Sons, Lisa took her place at the machine and began another tiring day. She noticed that Mrs. McRae in front of her was wearing a black armband. At lunch, her worst suspicions were confirmed. "Did you hear?" "Mr. McRae, killed in Belgium he was, never made it to the beach for the boat lift." "Just found out yesterday she did. Can you believe she's come to work today?" "That's what I'd do if it were me." The workers ate quickly. Their lunch break had been cut to 15 minutes. Lisa went back to work, filled with awe for the British people, who didn't seem to cry, who sacrificed everything. She watched Mrs. McRae's hands tremble as the woman sewed uniform after uniform. "I'm very sorry to hear what has happened," Lisa said softly. Mrs. McRae took her hand and pressed it warmly, saying nothing, then lifted another pant leg onto her machine. A button pinned to Mrs. McCrae's lapel read, "Support our men in arms." The fall of France left Britain alone to face Hitler, and the British steeled themselves for an expected invasion. There was a growing sense of paranoia about enemy aliens in their midst. Women who were too blonde were suddenly suspect. A poster showing a sleek, sophisticated blonde socialite surrounded by doting soldiers admonished, "Keep mum, she's not so dumb." People were looking everywhere for spies. Workers of German and Austrian ancestry were laid off, and 50,000 immigrants, aliens they called them, were rounded up and put behind barbed wire in racetracks, at factories, and on distant islands, such as the Isle of Man. It was long after lights out in the hostel when the whistle of the Grieg piano concerto in A minor sounded insistently from the hallway outside Lisa's bedroom. She leapt out of bed and shook Gina. They dressed and rushed downstairs to the dining room, where Aaron, Hans, and Paul stood in their pajamas holding a candle. "Gunther isn't back," Aaron said, worried. It was only midnight. Some of the others had been known to sneak in that late, but Gunther, he was never late. "What should we do?" asked Paul. "You should wake your mother," Paul said to Hans. "Why me? I'm already blind. I don't want to lose my ears, too." They had all come to accept Hans's sarcastic humor. The boys looked at Lisa, the meaning clear. She was the favorite, so it would fall to her to wake Mrs. Cohen. She knocked gently on the door, but there was no response, so she had to rap as loudly as she could. "What is it?" came the angry response. "Gunther hasn't come home." "Who?" "Gunther's missing!" Lisa yelled through the door. Mrs. Cohen appeared a minute later in the hallway, her long gray-brown hair loose on her shoulders, not in its normal place on top of her head. She grabbed the telephone in the alcove and ran her finger down a list of telephone numbers on the wall. "Is this the police station? This is Mrs. Cohen from the refugee hostel in Willesden Lane. I'm missing one of my charges." Lisa watched as Mrs. Cohen's face darkened. "Enemy alien? Is that a joke? He's a young boy," she shouted into the phone. "I know he's 16. I know he's German. What do you mean he'll be interned? He's Jewish." Mrs. Cohen slammed down the phone and opened a thick handwritten book listing the names and addresses of each resident's employer. Finding the number of Mr. Steinberg, the man Gunther worked for, she dialed and explained the situation, then nodded in gratitude. "Thank you so much." "Mr. Steinberg is English," she explained to the concerned teenagers. "He'll go right away to the police station and vouch for Gunther's loyalty. Now go to bed," Mrs. Cohen said. They didn't. They lit more candles and sat around the dining room table and waited. 16? Did Gunther have a birthday?" asked Paul. "Last week. He didn't tell anybody but me," Gina said. Aaron wandered into the dark living room and came back with the chessboard. He set up the pieces, and he and Hans played several games. The blind boy beat him almost every time. At the back of the house, Johnny was sitting on a milk crate, writing in his notebook by candlelight. "Johnny, what are you doing?" "When I can't sleep, I write," he said nervously. "May I see?" Lisa asked, leaning over to see. But Johnny put his huge hands over the page to cover it. "Oh, no. No. It's not any good," he insisted. "Maybe you'll show me another time," Lisa said, smiling, and headed out into the backyard. At 2 a.m, Hans and Aaron were still playing an endless endgame, chasing each other's kings back and forth across the board. Lisa was bored silly. "Hans," she said, "do you mind if I ask you something personal?" She tried to sugarcoat the question she had been wondering about for so long. "Have you always been blind?" He felt where Aaron had left his pawn, then let out a sigh, trying as hard as he could to sound flip. "No, God gave me this as his special present last year." "Last year?" "A mob at school beat me up the day after Crystal knocked. The actual diagnosis was that a chair leg hit my optic nerve. But not to worry, the rabbi said it was a gift." His voice dripped with sarcasm. Lisa was stunned. Why did he say that? He said it was a gift because otherwise my mother would never have taken me out of Berlin. We'd still be there. She would never have left. She never thought it would happen to her. He paused for a breath, then went on. You want to know a secret? She's never been to a synagogue. The room was silent for a moment. Then Hans put his hands on the chessboard again and made his move. Checkmate. At 3 a.m., the committee adjourned and went to bed. When Gunther finally came in late the following evening, he was immediately surrounded by his friends. Tell us what happened, they said in unison. Gunther had been on the double-decker bus coming back from work. His seatmate looked over, saw Gunther writing a letter in German, and called the police to arrest him as a spy. Gunther explained that he was writing a birthday card to the daughter of his employer and that he was Jewish. Why would he be a spy? But he had a German accent and an alien registration card and was taken to the station. Jewish or not, aliens over 16 were being interned. Luckily, Mr. Steinberg showed up in time and signed an affidavit stating that Gunther's work at his factory was critical to the war effort, and without him the assembly line would be shut down. Lisa turned to Paul and Aaron with a worried look. How old are you? 15, they replied in unison. But still, you better be careful. When Lisa and Gina were getting up from the table, Johnny came and slipped Lisa a piece of paper, then left silently. Lisa opened the envelope and read, Please do not show this to anyone else. She turned away from Gina and unfolded a poem. Always I see the faces at the station, and dimming before my eyes. Always I hear the voices that are calling out to me, but yet I cannot answer. My mother, my father, my sister, my brother, they are here now, always. My heart is with them. She looked up and saw Johnny staring at her from across the room. She was very moved by the simple words. Somehow his poem struck a chord in her heart in a way that was usually reserved for music alone. She winked at him and he smiled back, raising his pen as a salute. She folded the paper neatly and put it in her pocket, safe from prying eyes.